A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to Films I Should Have Talked About Years Ago, Season 2. What I got going on for today is a Bruce Lee installment. Yes, I finally got Bruce Lee around the mind today. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and kickstart it off by talking a bit about one of the many films he starred in, The Way of the Dragon, 1972. And I really ought to point it out, this one is my personal favorite of the grouping that he's been a part of since day one. And Bruce Lee has made a lot of Dragon materials for the Dragon film series, but this one really ranks higher than the others, by my accounts. And that's mostly because I hardly had the time to be able to see any of the rest, like The Big Boss, Fists of Fury, and pretty much any of the others. But The Way of the Dragon has its own pros and a few cons, for a good reason. What it's about is Bruce Lee himself goes on a trip to Europe to visit his cousin. And the big thing about this is that when he lands down in the middle of Rome, his cousin finds him, and they both head out in a nice Pontiac. His cousin explains to him that they are, in fact, going to need to correct a huge issue, and Bruce's help is needed in this situation. So what happens is that a restaurant in Rome itself is failing because a group syndicate has shown up, wanted to claim a hold of the land, and while she has refused multiple times, they have every effort they possibly could to scare away her customers, her employees, everybody, to ensure that the business is failing really bad. It's up to Bruce Lee to be able to fight these guys and reclaim the restaurant for her sake. Some people might look at that as a very simple concept for a plot, but I do find it to be rather intriguing because after all, I happen to be at the very front of a sucker front towards movies that allow for continuous divides between good and evil. In this case, you have a group of thugs who tried to steal business from a restaurant that happens to be owned by a relative of the main character himself, a legend at fighting. So when you really think about it, there's a lot that they are going for here. So what we basically got is Bruce Lee going up against a bunch of guys on his own. And he hardly has a lot of help along the way. And I do really appreciate the fact that the film quality itself is so bad, it practically cuts out on its own. It has a weird filter tone on it that makes it look more vintage than ever. But that's probably what happens when you have yourself film quality from overseas. The main point of this film, though, is the cast. Not just Bruce Lee himself, but also the almighty legend himself, Chuck Norris, who basically plays the main bad guy, Colt. So of course, when they go up against each other face to face at the very end, they both fight, you pretty much get your money and time's worth, and it sure is rather entertaining. Especially with Norris's undeniably hairy figure. I mean, look at that. Oh man, you could probably go any other way, but this film is certainly one of those that you might see every once in a while. It has appeared on various streaming platforms, and it's even free to watch on YouTube, which is basically how I saw it the last time, just so I could have the purpose of making a video on this series about this film. I do feel like that it's very entertaining because of the incredible fight sequences we get to see Bruce Lee on, with all the stock footage that they've gathered from previous films, and of course, much of the original footage that they put themselves. Overall, I do feel like that the Bruce Lee series itself, the Dragon films as they are highlighted as, sure are a blast to watch. And The Way of the Dragon happens to exceed them all due to how many times I've come back and watched it. Multiple times. And it sure is quite a piece. A cinematic piece that exceeds all expectations overseas compared to most other films from this time period. 50 years later, here we are still watching it, just like with the other Bruce Lee films. And it sure is still fun to see today. So with that in mind, my scoring on this, 7.2. And I do feel that a lot of you might have similar feelings or maybe different scorings. I don't know that for sure. But with that in mind, this is just my overall ranking on this entirety of an old school film.